Hello, and welcome to Mastering the Creative Task, which in Year 12 is your IA3. Now, my students always grizzle when I ask them to write creatively, and they tell me that it's unrealistic because no actual author would ever have to write to the same sort of criteria. Well, I've been disputing that for years, but I thought the easiest way to show them what I mean is to invite Brisbane author Nick Earls, who's a very highly celebrated author, invite him to come and join me. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to go through all of the criteria and tell you what it is that the marker's looking for and actually what the criteria mean. And then Nick's going to show you how he uses exactly that same technique in his own writing. So you'll see that in actual fact, they are held to criteria. No one actually gives them a criteria sheet at the end, but book sales and reviews are certainly going to tell us whether that author has managed to do what we expect in a creative piece of writing or not. So we're going to combine the theory and the practical, and you'll get a good idea of what both elements are looking for. So let's have a look at this task. Now, in the IA3, as you know, you're asked to respond creatively to a stimulus text. Now, that's really important, okay? Your teacher will determine what the stimulus is. So it might be a film, it might be a poem, it might be a short story, an illustrated text. There's a whole heap of things that you might be asked to respond to. But the trick here is that you must respond to the stimulus. So you're not just being asked to write a story, okay? It's got to clearly be seen to come from whatever the stimulus is. So the marker needs to be able to see the links between the stimulus and your original piece of writing. Now, be careful. It doesn't just mean that we want you to write a prose version of whatever the stimulus was. So if it was a film, we don't just want you to write it up. If it's a poem, we don't just want you to write it, that it's not in verse. So it can't just be a retelling of exactly the same thing, but we have to clearly be able to see the links between what the original was and how you came up with what you came up with. So how do you achieve this? Well, you need to reflect on the key ideas from the text, but you need to reimagine them into your own response. But it means that you need to clearly understand that original piece. So break it down, analyze it, break it into its separate components, and then work out how you're going to reflect them in your own writing. So it's really worth taking the time to do this, to look at the original text and break it down and think about what are the elements. So, for example, we might have a poem that, say it's about an old swagman who's in the bush and, living on his own in the middle of nowhere and, having a pretty hard life. So, for example, maybe the main characters in this text are an old man and his grandchild. The voice, well, it's told through the voice of the old man, okay, so we hear his side of the story. The setting is it's in an outback, it's isolated, and it's in very harsh land. The key ideas are that he needs to be strong, both physically and mentally. The importance of farming, and maybe there's a farm that's been in their family for generations, so there's a love and understanding of the land. There's continued importance of farming in modern society, and it also talks about the need for the human to maintain a level of strength and hope in order to survive. The mood in this particular text, we're going to say it's very wistful and reflective, and there's also a sense of pride. This man's very proud that he's managed to keep this farm in his family for generations and that he's managed to keep going against all odds. There's some key ideas in this story. We see parched earth, there's a lot of torrential rains, and we also see new life. And then the author's purpose is to show us how humans will always rise against adversity. So, nature can try and beat them down, but they're always going to come through and succeed. So if that's what the original text is, then you've got to think about what you want to do in your own text. Are you going to keep it as an old man and a grandchild? If not, what's a similar sort of relationship that you could show there? Maybe you don't want to tell this story through the old man's voice. Maybe you want to tell this one through the child's voice, or through maybe his wife's voice or somebody else's voice, so that we see a different perspective. It still, though, needs to be, it doesn't necessarily have to be in the outback, but you would still have to have those ideas of isolation and harshness, because otherwise our theme, our author's purpose doesn't work, okay? It's not going to show us that humans rise against adversity. So again, your key ideas are going to have to be the same, not necessarily about farming, but certainly about that need to be strong, both physically and mentally, and to overcome these obstacles. The mood needs to stay wistful and reflective, and those ideas of the parched earth, the torrential rains, the new life, in some form that should flow through into your own writing. So it's really worthwhile doing that deconstruction because, as I said, you're not just being asked to just write a story, okay? Your story has to have clear links back to that original stimulus text. So, having done that bit, now what? Well, now we've got to look at how we actually write an effective piece of creative writing. So I'm going to hand over to Nick and he's going to get us started.
A few years ago, my friend Terry, okay, that's not fair, making him look like a dorky explorer or someone about to pull a huge sled with his genitals. Here's how I'm supposed to show Terry. There we go. That's Terry the artist. You can see there behind his shoulder, there's an artwork of Terry's on the wall there. And Terry and I have worked on books together. We worked on a series called Word Hunters where he was the illustrator and I was the writer. A few years ago, he told me a story. And this was about an art project that he was working on. And he was asked to be part of an exhibition called Seven with Another. And how this series of exhibitions worked was that each time they would take 7 visual artists and they would pair them up with a practitioner from a different art form, and they would respond to whatever the theme of that exhibition was. Terry was part of the 4th series of that, and the theme was the number 4. And Terry and his co-worker decided to create the 4 horses of the apocalypse. And I can show you now how that worked out. It worked out pretty impressively. There it is. So each one of them, a horse skull there with a sort of bridle, but done hobby horse style with a pole, and each one decorated in the style of, decorated in a way that related to one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. But what interested me as much as that was the story that Terry told me about it. He said to me, you'd never guess how hard it is to get horse skulls in Brisbane legally. And he told me what he'd had to do to get them. He found someone who could provide horse heads, and that was someone who lived in the Sunshine Coast hinterland. And Terry went to drive there one summer Sunday afternoon, and he drove up the Bruce Highway towards the Sunshine Coast, to drive many people from Brisbane have done. But in this case, he took a right, he turned off the highway, and took a left, turned off the highway, and headed inland, and then went on to a series of progressively smaller and more rural roads until he was on an unsurfaced road. And then he came to a brick house, and he wondered if it was the right place. He rang the doorbell and he was told it was the right place, and he had to head down a bush track, and he was told to meet the guy who lived there down at the end of the bush track at a container that was there in the bush. And he drove down this track and parked his car at the container, and the car, then a ute drove up behind him in a cloud of dust, and the guy got out of the ute and he went to the container and he unlocked the container, and as he pulled the door of the container open, Terry said a cloud of water vapor billowed out, and when it cleared, he saw piles of frozen horse heads and frozen horse legs and other bits of horses. And he had this kind of awkward moment where he thought, have I made the right decision coming here? Is there another container just a bit further into the bush that's filled with human bits, and maybe I'm not going to get out of here? But it turned out it was all fine, and the guy loaded the horse heads into Terry's car and onto the tarp that he'd brought, these frozen horse heads. And then Terry had to drive them to a taxidermist who was going to boil them down and present him with the skulls. So he drove home got caught in the traffic on this hot Sunday afternoon in summer, and the car got warmer even despite the air conditioning. And the further he drove, the more he could sort of smell this sort of horse smell coming from the back. And he thought, I really don't want to be stopped by police now for a random breath test or something. And then they smell the horse smell and go, sir, would you mind opening your boot? And then Terry would be revealing 4 horse heads and having to explain himself. Fortunately, that didn't happen. Terry got home, he made his artwork, everything was fine. But he told me that story, and I thought that had some potential. And I said to him, you're not going to use that, are you? So can I have it? And he said I could. But let me tell you, that's not usually how it works with writing stories. Stories don't just arrive. But anyway, I decided, even as I was asking, that it was only going to be part of the story. And then I thought, do I have anything else to go with it? I looked through my pile of small ideas. I've got a pile where I just throw in any idea that's come along but hasn't got a home yet. And I found one in there from a couple of years before, from an incident when I'd gone to buy groceries a couple of years before. And this was at Coles at Toowong in Brisbane. And one of the things, the final item on my grocery list was a tub of Maggie Beer burnt fig, honeycomb and caramel ice cream. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever had that ice cream, but as far as kind of retail ice creams go, very hard to beat. It's kind of the ultimate retail ice cream, I would say. So I went to Coles with that on my list. But when I approached the freezer section, specifically the Maggie Beer section of the freezers, at that time Maggie Beer had quite a bit of the freezers at Coles at Toowong, I noticed that the shelves were empty. They weren't just empty. The tags had gone from the shelves. So I was afraid they'd destocked Maggie. And I stood there kind of staring at the empty shelves as though ice cream might just materialize in front of me, which it didn't. And there was a staff member down on the floor, kneeling down with a box cutter and opening a box to shelve some lemon sorbet. And so I said to her, do you know where the Maggie Beer's gone? And she very hesitantly, despite being the one in the conversation holding a box cutter, said to me, oh, I don't think they stock it anymore, as she sort of backed away. And I just sort of stared at the ice cream and I thought, it's not her fault they don't stock it. Don't take down the person filling the shelves in Coles. It's a useful role. It's not her fault. And then she tried to help me and she said, but I hear that one's pretty good, she said, pointing at some probably random ice cream before getting right out of the aisle. I bought the pretty good ice cream and I took it home and it turned out to be pretty good. But was that what I was wanting when I went to Coles? Pretty good? It was not. So I was really not happy about that. So because it's the 21st century and we're intolerant of just about everything, I then went immediately online and tweeted to Coles saying, what are you thinking? Destocking the Maggie Beer ice cream at Toowong. And Coles commendably got back to me in a few minutes and said, well, it was pretty much only you buying it, so don't expect it to come back. So appreciation for the honesty there. And but then I thought, and so that annoyed me, but me being annoyed in that first world problem kind of way is not a story. But I thought, give that to someone who has a lot more at stake, who really needs the ice cream, and it might be a story. So I thought of giving it to a guy who's been retrenched at the end of the mining boom and he's living with his rich sister and brother-in-law, and it could be a story about how small his world gets and what it's like to find meaning in it. So there's this kind of self-esteem lowering moment occurs. Something else happens in his day that lowers his self-esteem further in a life where he's facing some challenges anyway. And he just thinks, I need one good thing to happen in my day. And he goes out for a walk on this hot summer evening with $20 in his pocket to buy that particular ice cream, the Maggie Beer ice cream, and a $2 spoon. And he just wants to buy the ice cream and eat it, and for a moment in his day not feel bad. And what happens? He has to settle yet again. This time he has to settle for the pretty good ice cream. So then he finds himself sitting on the brick wall outside a random unit block in Toowong in Brisbane with his $2 spoon and his pretty good ice cream, thinking this is where my life has got. So I had that little idea, which could have been by itself a short story, but I've been holding on to it for something bigger. And then I thought, why don't I give that and the road trip to the same character? His sister's a successful artist, and the central character is a guy who's found himself in a bit of a hole and he's trying to feel useful. So it's him and Harrison, his 4-year-old nephew who he's looking after, who go on the road trip to pick up horses' hairs. So I had myself a character, and at an interesting time in his life. I had a small cast of other characters around him, some incidents that were going to occur and push and pull him in interesting directions, and I was well on the way to this novella. Now, you're going to be writing a piece of narrative. You're going to be writing a story as part of assessment. When that happens, what you'll be given is a topic, some stimulus material, a week to prepare, and on the day, 15 minutes to plan, 2 hours to write, and an 800 to 1,000 word range to work with. Now, does that mean that Terry conveniently turns up with a perfectly sized chunk of story for you? No. Does it mean that when you take your first look at the task and the stimulus material, that you instantly, spontaneously have a great idea? No. Or at least a workable one that looks like an idea for a story. No, it doesn't mean that either. So it's natural to get stuck, or at least to feel stuck. Have any of you ever felt stuck when you faced one of these tasks? That's really normal. What I want to do is combine with Jean to give you some tools that you can use to unstick yourself, make progress, and plan and write something great. So here's something every writer needs to remind themselves of. If you only let yourself have great ideas, you might stop yourself having any ideas at all. There's no better way to make a brain feel blank than to tell it to think something. And that's what we risk doing when we tell ourselves we have to come up with a story to write. Because we're waiting to think a story. Our brain has plenty of ideas, but too often we ignore ideas that we're having because they haven't arrived as fully fledged stories ready to write. It's very unusual for the human brain to think and complete new stories, and as writers, we have to work with how our brains work. So value small ideas and don't lose them. In your case, you know right where to look for those first small ideas. Your stimulus material. You'll be given a poem or some fiction or a film. Your job is not to rewrite those, but to find something in them that will allow you to develop a piece of writing that fits with the task. Read the piece you've been given and see how it affects you. What does it make you think? What does it make you feel? What attitudes or beliefs does it address, and how do they fit with or challenge yours? Are there any things in there, a character, a moment, that, like my Maggie Beer experience, stand out as something you might build on? Don't expect to stare at the stimulus material long enough until you see a story. Your stimulus material will give you glimpses of things that might be explored further, and that's all you need it to do. Write them down, don't lose them, apply the tools we'll discuss today, and you'll have yourself the story you need. You'll be given the task sheet a week before you write your story. Today, we're going to tell you how you can use that prep time and your exam time most effectively, and the tools that will let you do it. I know you won't be devoting an entire uninterrupted week to preparing, but you don't need to. What you need to do is allocate periods of time across the week and use them strategically and effectively. However much prep time you allocate across that week, I'll be dividing it into thirds. I'll be recommending some steps for the first third of that time, some for the middle third, and some for the final third. Now, these are recommendations, not rules, but I'm recommending them because they work. Now let's hear from Jean about some of the criteria that you have to apply when you're doing your piece of writing for assessment, and some of the descriptors on the task sheet.
Okay, so from what Nick's just said, hopefully you'll understand that it doesn't matter what you're writing or why you're writing. It doesn't matter whether you're writing to publish a book, whether you're just writing for pleasure, whether you're writing to meet a particular assessment task. If it's creative, you're looking at exactly the same elements, or if you like, you're looking at exactly the same criteria. The same rules, if you like, apply no matter what the purpose of the writing is. So we're going to take a look at what these rules are, at exactly what your markers are wanting to see in your piece of writing. So the first criteria is knowledge application. And the markers here are looking for two things, knowledge of two things. Firstly, you need to show knowledge of the original stimulus text. So they need to see that you understand its key messages, that you understand what the characters are like, the mood, the setting, what's going on at the crux of that text. And then, of course, they want to see those same ideas replicated in your own piece of writing. The second thing that they want to see knowledge of is the craft of creative writing. So you need to show that you understand how creative writing is different from, say, analytical or persuasive writing. And that's showing control over language elements, structural elements, and other aspects that make writing creative. So there's three descriptors in this criteria. Firstly, that your work needs to show subtle and complex creations of perspectives and representations of concepts, identities, times, and places in an imaginative text. The second one is that you need to show discerning manipulation of the ways that cultural assumptions, attitudes, values, and beliefs underpin texts and invite audiences to take up positions. And then the third is to have a discerning use of aesthetic features and stylistic devices to prompt emotional and critical audience responses. So we're going to go through each of these and show you exactly what that means for a start, and then how to achieve that in your writing. So let's have a look at this first one, the subtle and complex creation of perspectives and representations of concepts, identities, times, and places in a text. So what this is looking for is every piece of writing, it has a context. So where and when it's set, the values and attitudes that are in action at that time and in that place, these are all the sorts of things that we would expect to see reflected in a piece of writing. But the key words here are subtle and complex. So we don't just want to, give the readers a whole lot of facts. We don't want to just hit them with something out of Wikipedia. So we need to work out nice, subtle ways to work this into our story. Now, in your case, you're lucky. You know the time, the place, the values, the attitudes, and the beliefs because they were in your original stimulus piece of writing. What you need now is an idea that's going to serve as the vessel through which you can convey these ideas to your audience. So you need a way to subtly convey this information in your narrative without just writing a prose version of the original text. So, where do you get these ideas?
I want to look at ideas themselves and how they work and what you can do with them. For a start, don't judge ideas until you have to. While we're developing the small ideas we're starting out with, not every idea that follows is a great one. But some ideas that don't seem great might lead to something great if we hold on to them. They won't if we let them go. So even if your ideas don't all seem great and some might conflict with others, keep them in the mix in the first third of your prep week because you haven't settled on your story yet. And remember, writing is thinking. The pen is only involved to help you put your thoughts on the page. It's easy to think of the task as the 2 hours you'll be writing in the exam, but the key to the writing you do then is the thinking done beforehand. You can't expect to write without thinking. Think, value that thinking, and make notes. You can think if you've got 10 minutes in the car or on a bus, while you're in the gym or out for a walk or a run. Take a story question with you and think about it. Make it deliberate. I go for a run most days, and one time just before I went for a run, I'd read a Rolling Stone article about a rapper. And on my run, I was thinking that rappers could be interesting. And I started to just kind of play a game with rapper names while I was out on the run. And I thought, what would be, I wanted to come up, I was just kind of amusing myself. And I thought, what would be the rapper name that I could come up with that would amuse me most, that would include some of the essential criteria for rapper names, that is dodgy spelling and incorporating at least one symbol. And the name I came up with that I liked best was Nasty Boy. So I had Nasty Boy in my head, And then I started thinking maybe this could be a character. And if it's a character, who is Nasty Boy? What's his story? How do I get into his head? And then I thought maybe we don't. Maybe that's the challenge in the story. Maybe I've got to send an Australian rock journalist to interview him. I can get into that character's head. I even know several Australian rock journos. So then I had two characters to work with. And I started thinking, what is it that the rapper's trying to hide? What is it that he's keeping inside that he doesn't want to let out? How does the journalist go about bringing it out? This is a key part of my process now. Ask questions and create possibilities. It's questions like those that help me find story material. Look at your small early ideas and ask questions of them. Who is this happening to? Why is it happening? What brought this person to this place at this time? How will they respond? Play around with ideas like that. Speculate, hypothesize. Investigation yields more than inspiration. Inspiration is a matter of luck. Investigation is something you can take charge of. Your story needs a structure, but you need to have something to structure. So build in discovery time in the first third of your prep week. This process is valuable and shouldn't be stopped prematurely because you think you should have worked the story out already. It's okay to have a mess of ideas at this point in the process. It's far better to have enough ideas to make a mess than not. Turns out I live that notion in life as well. My father looks at my messy desk and, okay, look, that's it at an extremely messy state. That's late in a book tour when I've come back home and dumped stuff on the desk several times and clearly on the chairs as well, and sometimes on the floor. So that is it at its worst, but it's never tidy. It is always kind of messy. And my father looks at my messy desk and says, I hope your brain's not like that. And I look at it and I think, I hope it is. I can organize mess into a story, but I can't organize an empty desk into anything. And that's why my dad spent 60 years as a management consultant and I write stories. Next, know when to think divergently and when to think convergently. Of course, you can't keep adding to your ideas pile forever, and time and word limits won't allow it. You need to contain the scope of your ideas and your story to use your 1,000 words to maximum effect. You move from thinking divergently, creating possibilities, to thinking convergently, selecting the ideas that you'll develop further and use. This doesn't mean you won't have new ideas, but it means you're changing gear in terms of how you're dealing with ideas. And I recommend that you make that a conscious choice, typically about a third of the way through your preparation. Once you've found enough parts and made enough parts, you can interrogate them and you'll start to see the narrative. You'll start to see something happening to people and to get a sense of a transformation from who they are before the story to who they are after. Write that down, keep checking your planning and your writing against it, and refine when necessary. Start making notes about the plot line that will be the spine of your story. Building on this convergent thinking involves new tools, and we'll look at those individually as we go through the marking criteria.
So the second descriptor that you need to meet is that your work needs to show discerning manipulation of the ways cultural assumptions, attitudes, values, and beliefs underpin texts and invite audiences to take up positions. So what does this mean? Well, you now know where and when your story is set, and you've got some ideas about a framework through which you can tell that story. But you need to think about these attitudes that are existing in the culture in which this story is set. So, for example, can you see in the original text, can you see racism or sexism or class divisions or any issue going on in this text? And there will be one. What is it that the author is wanting to say about these attitudes? Are they reflecting and supporting these attitudes, or are they criticizing them and challenging these attitudes? And that's what you've got to try and find a way to subtly convey in your own writing. So how do we do it subtly? Well, for example, let's have a look at this particular sentence. So if we take the sentence, Archie rubbed at his skin, fearing that once again it would cause him to be shunned. Okay, now, yes, Archie might have a dermatological condition, but more likely than that, his skin is causing problems for a reason. Now, what reasons are people shunned for their skin? This is probably a colour issue. So we can see that there's racism in this community without actually having to make the statement, Archie lived in a very racist community. So we want to try and convey these ideas as subtly as we possibly can. So Nick's going to have a look now at how we can do that really effectively.
Every story exists in a context, and this descriptor looks at that, both from the perspective of how that context affects the characters, the story and the writing, and the perspective of how it affects the way it will be read. Jean has mentioned cultures and attitudes. I want to look at how to make that work in a story. One of the most powerful levers you can pull to draw maximum marks here is character. And how do you do that effectively? Only invent the people you need and make a choice to invent each one of them. Creating a character burns creative fuel. Each character is a new person for a reader to invest in too. Give each character specific consideration and there'll be more compelling characters and bring more to your story. Characters, like people, are made up of many small parts, and that's why it's best to get to know those parts before writing them. A character we haven't thought enough about is much more likely to feel like a type than a person. And the better we know a character, the better placed we are to reveal them and their attitudes through their choices, rather than telling the reader what they're like. How do we make characters distinct? Through their detail, appearance, gestures, thoughts, what they say and how they say it. We'll look more at those, but our first two thoughts we need to have about character are, I need to contain my cast to the minimum number required to tell the story, and I will invest in detail to create memorable characters rather than forgettable types.
So the third descriptor then is the discerning use of aesthetic features and stylistic devices to prompt emotional and critical audience responses. So this is where we get to have some fun. There's 4 pieces of writing that you do in Senior English, and each one of them is designed to see how you can use language differently according to the purpose and the style of writing. So this one, unlike an analytical piece, which just needs to be very factual and very intellectual and academic, this piece, the creative piece, you can really go to town. This is where you get to craft language, where you get to manipulate words and to sort of delve into their nuances and their connotations and create word pictures and to really have an emotional impact on your reader. So when we talk about the aesthetics of a piece of writing, we're not talking about how pretty it is or how attractive it is. What we're looking at is the figurative language that's being used. So the marker's looking to see that you are actually using language creatively, that you're not just writing a factual piece or an analytical essay or even a persuasive speech. So we want to see some similes and metaphors. We want imagery, we want atmosphere, and we really want figurative language. So these are all the elements that we need to see. And to really do well, we want to see how these images, how this figurative language has been drawn from the original stimulus. So there might be similes and metaphors that the original authors used that you could pull through and use in your own writing. Obviously, you don't want big chunks of plagiarism, but all of those little connections are the things that are going to make this very subtle and very clever.
One of the key elements here is language, by which I mean both the words we use and how we put them together. You're going to be rewarded for prompting audience responses. So how do we use language to do that? Through character, through the voice of the story and the voices of its characters. If we can use those to connect the reader with our characters, we maximize our chances of provoking a response. So find your voices. Each of your characters needs a distinctive voice when they speak. Finding those voices should be another deliberate step during your planning process, maybe in the middle third of your prep time week. Walk around trying to get to know their voices, testing them out by saying things. This is not an activity encouraged during exam conditions itself, but perfectly acceptable in your own home in the days beforehand. When you hit on a sentence that sounds particularly true to the character, write it down. Anytime when you're writing and that character's voice feels as though it's wandering, go back to that sentence and say it a few times to recalibrate. If you're writing in first person, your protagonist also needs a voice for their internal narrative. It'll be related to their speaking voice, but it might not be identical. Work out how they think and speak and be ready to play that character. Plan like an author, write like your character. This particularly applies if you're writing in first person. Plan your central character's transformation across the story, then live through each moment as you're writing it. Don't think of yourself as writing about your character. Inhabit your character and connect with each moment to deliver each part of your story as effectively as possible. If you inhabit your character to write them, you'll avoid the classic first-person traps. If you're writing in first person, your character can't read minds and they can't see through walls. Remember always, with first person, that what you pass on to the reader is limited by what your narrator knows and experiences. Which leads to this: choose whether your view is aerial or intracranial. Make this a distinct choice and see these as two different phases of the job. Here's what I mean by aerial and intracranial. In the planning phase, you can be the author there looking down on this world, observing, analysing and mapping out the whole story. Then in the writing phase, put yourself with this person or these people in this moment, see what they're seeing, feel what they're feeling and put that on the page. You can start your prep week on the roof, but when you're writing, aim to be down with the people and in their heads. When you're doing your planning, you have the wide angle lens. When you're with your characters, you don't. But it's the advanced planning and the decisions you make then that give you everything you need when you're down with your characters. Get close to the people in your story and you'll pull the readers close to them too. You will create emotional stakes and you will make the reader care. Even when your reader is a time-poor teacher with an unwieldy pile of stories to mark. Don't just be competent, get to them. And how do you get to them? Through connecting with characters and with language that is right for your characters and their world.
So now we come to the second criterion, which is organisation and development. So this is looking to see, can you actually structure this as a creative piece? Now, the close details of your structure will depend on the actual genre that your teacher has specified. But regardless of what that genre is, everything creative is going to follow the same sort of pattern. So you need to have a discerning use of the patterns and conventions of an imaginative text and the role of the writer to achieve particular purposes and relationships with audiences. You need to show discerning selection and synthesis of this subject matter to support perspectives. And you need to show discerning organisation and sequencing of subject matter to achieve particular purposes, including the discerning use of cohesive devices to emphasise ideas and connect parts of an imaginative text. So what are we actually looking for? Well, to start off with, the discerning use of the patterns and conventions of an imaginative text and the role of the writer to achieve particular purposes and relationships with the audience. So there's two elements to this criterion. So the first is to use the patterns and conventions of an imaginative text. So what that means is we have to have an orientation, a complication, and a resolution in the same way that any piece of narrative writing has to have. But it's also asking you to write to achieve a particular purpose. So you need to think about, what is it that you're wanting to achieve with your readers? Do you want them to laugh? Do you want them to cry? Do you want them to get angry? Do you want them to enact some sort of change? Do you want them to rethink their beliefs? What is it that you as the writer are hoping for as the outcome of this particular piece of writing? So here the marker wants to see that you know and can apply the elements and the structure of a good narrative. It's an easy place for you to pick up some extra marks. So even if you're not really that good at crafting words or at using imagery and all of those elements, This is a place that you can really pick up some extra marks, because so long as you structure this the way a narrative should be structured, then you're going to be nailing those top descriptors.
When I see the word patterns, one word I think of is structure, but I'll hold thoughts on structure back until a little later. Let's look at purposes and how to achieve them. What do you want to reveal to the reader, and how are you going to do it? Your ultimate purpose behind a story written for assessment might be to get the highest mark possible, but that's external to the story, and you won't get there by focusing on it. The way you'll get there is with a focus on the story itself and its internal purpose. What's going on in the story? What perspectives might your reader bring? What perspectives might you set up? And how might you shift them through the reading experience you deliver? Have a clear idea of your intent and then look to your writing tools to deliver it. So how do we deliver it? How do we take the idea of conventions of an imaginative text and turn it into tools we can actually use? With the help of this man. Anton Chekhov. Don't tell me the moon is shining, show me the glint of light on broken glass. What does Chekhov mean by that? Now, Chekhov was a great writer of theatre and short stories, a Russian writer of the late 19th and early 20th century. What's he doing there? He's telling us show, don't tell, but in fact, he's showing us show, don't tell, which is what I think is extra good about this quote, is that he actually practices it while he's preaching it. You've been hearing the show, don't tell message one way or another for years, but how is it actually done? It's done through characters and it's done through detail. It's the author who has decided the moon is shining. It's the character who sees the glint of light on broken glass. And for you to be the author who can inhabit the character, you need to have done two things. The character work to let you into that person's head, and the detail work so that you know there's glass there and it's broken. Get this right, and you turn yourself into the best kind of writer of fiction. This kind. The invisible writer. Telling is a visible authorial act. Showing is a natural event in the world of your characters. Get that right, and the relationship with your audience is one of a direct connection between the reader and the characters, and there's no sign that you were ever there, other than your name being wherever assessment rules require it, maybe near the top in the spot where the reader will feel obliged to put an impressive mark. So let's try that with this. Yeah, a picture of a rundown house. Now, what details might you use here to show us that the house is in a rundown state, rather than telling us the house looked run down? What might a character see and reveal to the reader? You can pause for a moment if you want to think about that, write some things down, find some specific things there about the house that will reveal to us that that house is in a somewhat derelict state, rather than telling us you turned up at a house that's in a somewhat derelict state.
So then we come to the next descriptor, discerning selection and synthesis of subject matter to support perspectives. So you've done all your heavy lifting here. You know, you've got your time, you've got your place, you've got your characters, you've got your story idea, and you've got a purpose. But now you've got to think about how you can convey all of this to your readers in an interesting and creative way, without just sort of giving them a knowledge dump and telling them a whole lot of facts about the situation. So here we have to select very carefully. You've got to very carefully consider what you're going to include in this story. But perhaps just as importantly, or maybe even more so, you've got to decide what elements you're actually going to leave out.
How do you support your perspectives? You remain clear about what they are. What is this story about? Who is this story about? Two very simple questions that will help you navigate through the writing. Settle on those during your planning week and measure everything you write by them. Am I advancing the story in an interesting way? Am I revealing character in an interesting way? Make one or both of those the business of each paragraph and you will be on track. This is why you get a week to prepare and why you need to view that week as an asset and use it. These questions are simple, but the answers are a lot less likely to come if you ask them for the first time on the day you turn up to write the story. These questions will help you sort out issues of point of view and structure when everything is still at the planning stage and entirely negotiable. One other key aspect of selection is containment. I've already recommended that you contain your cast of characters, but you also need to contain your story. You have 1,000 words maximum, and you need to choose a story that can be effectively told over that short span. This starts at the ideas phase, early in planning, and is worth re-asking as your week goes on because the scope of stories can expand unless we keep a tight rein. Don't allow scope creep. Don't be this guy when he thought, hey, I think I'll write a trilogy about this place with dragons and devious royals, only to find yourself decades later still hunched over your 1980s IBM PC, punching out sentences in a word processing app that is so old it predates the word app and no one even knows who owns it anymore, up to book 6 of your trilogy, saying to yourself, only 3,000 pages to go. Yes, George R.R. Martin has managed to live with scope creep, but funded by a TV adaptation that won 58 Emmys. So the message for you when writing for assessment is, don't be George. During your planning, be mindful of containing the scope, containing the story, and containing the writing task that lies in wait. How do you do that? Maybe think about it this way. However big and wide-ranging your ideas, pick a moment, pick a key character, and from that person's long and potentially complicated life, pick a moment when some kind of transformation might occur. Some kind of transformation that fits with the task and lets you do what you need to do about cultural assumptions, values, etc. Work out the kind of thing you need to show, work out where it fits in the life of the characters, and give it to them. Who were they before that moment? Who were they after that moment? Answer those questions and deliver that answer on the page, and you'll have done your job while you're still a lot younger than this guy.
So then the third descriptor in this section is the discerning organisation and sequencing of subject matter to achieve particular purposes, including the discerning use of cohesive devices to emphasise and connect parts of an imaginative text. Now, at first glance, this might look exactly the same as the last descriptor that we just had, but this one actually applies specifically to your piece of writing. So the marker wants to see here that, sure, you know what the structure of a narrative should be, but that you've done something original with it, that it's not just completely dull and following the rules of a narrative, but that it's shaping them into something original and a bit less formulaic. So we want to combine our ideas and connect our ideas in a way that does something that's a little bit different and takes our readers on a more unexpected journey.
Organisation and sequencing of subject matter suggests it's time to take a close look at structure. Building a structure takes structural tools. Through the first third of your planning, through thinking divergently, you have people, incidents, and revelations. And now in the middle third of your planning, you need new tools to organise them in the most fascinating way you can. I have several tools that I use to do that, and I might use one or more depending on what fits. I'm going to show you the tools that I use to structure novels, novellas, and short stories. So don't panic if you notice a lot of detail. For a 1,000-word story, you'd be using a simpler and quicker version of what you're about to see, but the principles still apply, and that's why I want to show it to you. So I might try a timeline. This is a timeline for a novella that I've been working on. And as you can see from the top, I wasn't sure if it'd take place on Friday and Saturday or Friday, Saturday and Sunday. And I thought I would look at it from the perspective of the character's relationships with a couple of people. One is someone he meets in a business context, and the other is his stepson at home. So as you can see there, I've put down the 3 meetings with the person that he meets in a business context, and I've tried to maneuver other things around that and worked out how those different plot lines or character lines will interact with each other. The most effective way of organising those parts with regard to each other so that things land in the context that I want them to. Might also use a calendar. This is a calendar which includes some actual events. This is one of the reasons to use a calendar. If you're including actual events, they need to occur on the days in which they occurred. So in this case, I put the actual events down, particular dinners and announcements and various other things. I put them down on the calendar first, and then I worked out where my story elements would go. But sometimes it can be useful to do a calendar just to get a sense of the shape of the story and perhaps opportunities to tighten the story. For example, this one here. This is a calendar for a novel, and I thought it would take place over about 4 weeks. So I drew myself up a calendar that covered 4 weeks, but then in the process of putting the story elements down, I realized I could tell it in just 11 days. So there were 17 days I didn't need to cover. And that's great, because if you've got days in your story in which nothing happens, you've got to account for them somehow. And you don't want to have to go inventing story just to pad that out. So by working out that I could tell this story in 11 days instead of in 28, the story was held nice and tightly together, and I didn't have those gaps that I had to account for when the character might have been doing who knows what. So a calendar can be useful for that. Or I might do my floor map. I might have all my scene notes where I have little bits of things that I know I want to write about, and I put them out on the floor. And what I'll do is I'll tend to, this is from a novel. So again, this had like 70 pieces to it. So it was quite complicated. And you can see the one with the most bits there is part of the major plot line. And then there are 3 subplots there as well with fewer elements to them. So I had a rough idea of the order of things within each plot line, but this allowed me to move them around within plot lines, and then it allowed me to work out where the plot lines would intersect so that I could eventually not just have things lined up within their plot lines, but then merge my plot lines and pick all these pieces up so that I had a pile of 70 or so bits of paper in the order that I was going to use when I put them together as an outline. Now, with a short story, maximum 1,000 words, you're not going to have 70 bits of paper. If you do, you're not going to contain your story. But there'll be a few elements of the story that you might have, and there might be a couple of different things interacting with each other, the past and the present, bringing the past up into the present, or a couple of people's agendas. So it can sometimes help to make this process physical by putting those notes on bits of paper and moving them around or seeing how they go. The chop up is kind of a version of that. The chop up is where I've started thinking that some sort of related ideas will come together and become much more related and become a story. So I've created a file on my laptop, and then when I have new ideas, I just add them to the file, but they're not in the right spot. So what I'll then do is I'll actually, to make it physical, step away from the laptop and the blank wall in front of me. I'll actually print it and cut it out, and I'll move those pieces around. And then I'll go and recreate that on screen, and that will help give me my outline. Now, each one of these is not expected to deliver the one right answer, but each one is a chance to think differently, to pull the developing story out of your head, put it somewhere and move it around a bit. Giving structure of physicality makes you think about it differently. This turns incidents into a story by lining them up in the most powerful order. This gives your characters a journey rather than just sending them into haphazard events. This is where you increase the stakes in the story by dropping incidents in where they will be most revealing or most influential to the plot. Which brings us to a specific matter of structure. Enter the story as late as possible and exit as soon as the business is done. I'm sure you've heard of sizzling starts. And why not? They make total sense. You want your start to sizzle. Chances are that by year 2, your teachers had you onto that, and it was your first move away from a simple beginning, middle, end model of story structure. Sizzling start advice is in primary school classrooms across the country, and it's all over the internet, and there's a reason for that. Your first page has to hook the reader. Your first paragraph has to drop us into the action, some kind of action, something compelling, even if we don't know what it all means here. In fact, if we don't know what it all means, that's another reason to read on. Then, as the writer, you need to be well aware of what crucial things the reader doesn't know and work out how to thread them in naturally, how to use incidents and conversation and detail to bring them to the surface. Now, some of my most successful novels, those 3 novels, in fact, lost their first chapters during editing. I hadn't worked out then, I hadn't made this a specific tool. I hadn't made it a thing I deliberately focused on, working out my entry point into a story. And with each of these 3 novels, I actually entered it in the place I thought was right, but wrote what turned out to be an introductory chapter. And there's not much compelling about introductions. You need to get into something that will grab people. And in each of these cases, the editor noticed that and pointed out that the action started happening in chapter 2. So how about I started with chapter 2 and then I had to go back and work out why I thought I had to write chapter 1 in the first place. And I had to take the essential bits of chapter 1 and work out how to thread them in seamlessly into chapters 2, 3, and 4 so that that stuff would appear without me writing a not very interesting introductory chapter. Starts, there are some starts that have lost their sizzle. So be ready for that. Explosive onomatopoeia. If you're inclined to begin with bang and some exclamation marks or boom with some exclamation marks, your teacher's seen that an awful lot of times. So try to do something a bit different. At the other end of the spectrum, if you're inclined to begin with a girl or a young woman weeping and collapsing to the floor or sliding down a wall, teachers have gone there as well quite a few times before. So surprise them. Find something that's right for your story. It's getting to know your story and your characters through the thinking you've already done that will let you pick the right moment and pick the right way to tell it. And that's where the sizzle comes from. Here's how my novella, Vancouver, opens. For at least a week, the Calgary Tower was rumoured to be a target, but so far it's still standing. On the flight out, there's a glimpse of the downtown area, the pale concrete tower and office blocks clad in granite and glass, bright in the late morning sun, a clear, cold sky beyond them all across the prairie. Then the plane tilts and turns west towards Vancouver. I am on my way to meet our giant again. After all this time, he is in my head like a figure in a fable, a story, one I could tell if the slightest chance opened up. So this is a story that starts in the early 1970s and ends 30 years later in 2001 with a big gap in the middle. And it took all my structural tools to work out that the time to enter the story was 3 days from the end. And then flash back to the 70s to show why the meeting in the present is going to matter, then come back to the present to see it happen. So what do you get from the opening? It puts you into some kind of action. There's a threat. It puts you in a place on a plane above Canada. And then it says there's a giant and the narrator is on his way to meet him again. That should leave the reader wanting more. And I can pretty much guarantee that even the most jaded of markers hasn't read that opening before. Same applies to the end. It needs to be the right moment, delivered the right way. It's easy to overtell an ending to tie up every loose end. You've very likely heard of the expression Hollywood ending. Let's look at a definition of that. An outcome considered to be typical of certain movies produced in Hollywood, California, in which all desirable results are achieved, with protagonists being rewarded, antagonists being punished or destroyed, and positive sentiments, love, happiness, peace, prevailing over negative. See the word typical in the first line there. Once something becomes typical, it becomes predictable, and we can do better than that. Think about your protagonist's journey in the story, what transformation they actually need to go through. Do that, and then finish. Don't overfinish it. Don't feel the need to tie up every loose end. Give the reader space to do some thinking.
So then we come to the third criterion, which is our textural features. Now this is looking at the nitty-gritty of your writing. This is your language choices, your spelling, grammar, punctuation. So we're looking here for a discerning use of language choices for particular purposes, discerning combination of a range of grammatically accurate or appropriate language structures, including clauses and sentences, to achieve particular purposes. And we're looking for the discerning use of written features, including conventional spelling and punctuation, to achieve particular purposes. So let's go through them one by one. So discerning language choices for particular purposes. Now, a lot of people think that this means that big words are better words, but it's not always the case. So we need to choose the most appropriate word for the situation. I once had a student who was trying not to show that he'd plagiarized, and he looked up this word that said somebody cocked their head above the battlefield, and he clearly didn't know what it meant, but he put it into dictionary.com, and it told him that a cock was a rooster, and so he wrote that this person roosted their head. Now, he would have been much better to say the person lifted their head, okay? So the big word isn't necessarily the best one. If we say to somebody, are you walking home this afternoon? They'll know exactly what we're asking, and they'll know what their answer is. However, if we ask them, do you intend to perambulate to your abode this post-meridian? They're going to think we're an absolute loser. We've asked the same question. They're not going to answer us, and they're probably going to run a million miles away. So the best word is always the one that does the job for us. And a lot of times, the best thing that we can do is to use very specific words. And Nick's going to show you what I mean by that.
This is your chance to be specific, and there is power in specificity. This can happen in the final third of your planning week. If details come to you earlier than that, that's great. Note them down, but focus on it then. Don't be general when you can be specific. 30 years ago or close to it, I was at a writers' festival and I heard the writer and broadcaster Wendy Harmer say, sometimes it can be a biscuit, but sometimes it has to be a Tim Tam. I knew what she meant by that. It was about being specific over being general. I took that to heart, but I actually, turns out, only worked out later that I took it way more literally than I should have. And over the course of multiple books, I found myself mentioning Tim Tams in a surprisingly favourable light. And with all of those references to Tim Tams and books that came to people's attention, after doing that, I was actually contacted by Arnott's, someone in the publicity area at Arnott's, who wanted to recognise my continuous recognition of Tim Tams by offering me free Tim Tams, a truckload of Tim Tams, in fact. And I thought, my first thought was, that's brilliant. And my second thought was, that might not be in my best long-term interest in terms of my health. So I thought, is there a way that I can respond to this lovely gesture and come out of it in a physically healthy state, still fitting my clothes? So I thought maybe those Tim Tams could go to Penguin, the publishing company that was publishing me at the time, and they were in Melbourne and the Arnott's person was in Melbourne, and it just seemed like a great idea that Arnott's would send their massive truckload of Tim Tams to Penguin at Ringwood and hand over those Tim Tams, and I'd say the Tim Tams are coming because of me, and I'd be the hero author. They'd be eating their Tim Tams going, that Nick Earls, he's awesome. He's such a major author that people just throw biscuits at us. We're going to have to sell lots more of his books. And so they would be really on my side. So I told them that the Tim Tams were coming, and they braced themselves for the Tim Tams. And then the person who promised the Tim Tams left Arnott's, and the Tim Tams never arrived. So I then looked not like the awesome author who was so powerful he could bring biscuits raining down on them, but I looked like an author who just told kind of self-aggrandizing lies and was then exposed as some kind of charlatan. So I wasn't happy about that, but you shouldn't ever promise things to an author and then not deliver, because authors can always get you back. And I was writing a book at that time, and I thought, how can I work a Tim Tam into a book, into this book in some way that something bad happens to the Tim Tam and a Tim Tam goes where a Tim Tam has never gone before and never should go. So in the end, I got them back. Like everything else, this decision about using specifics rather than generalities should be made as a conscious choice. You don't want to weigh a piece down with relentless brand names or shut readers out by using details they don't know. But a specific detail where it's feasible to use one allows the reader to make a stronger connection with what's going on. It's instantly more visual and it's more revealing of the characters and circumstances. Does your new minor character turn up driving a car, or do they drive a battered white Corolla, or do they drive a lovingly restored orange Charger with matching orange tyre walls, or do they drive a new black Lexus four-wheel drive? It all might reveal something about the character, or at least frame your readers thinking about that character. You can tweak how you present that character as you go to make them kind of more nuanced, but get people started by giving them some details. So let's try that now. Let's take a sentence full of generalities that sends teachers to sleep on a regular basis, and let's make it specific. I got up and got dressed. Of course you did. But it's not that interesting. How can we make that specific? Can you suggest any specific alternatives? What I suggest here is you look at both got up and got dressed. The way you handle those can reveal things like the level of urgency or lack thereof, the age of the character, the affluence of the character, the job the character does if the character's working, the climate or season that the character is in. Just by tweaking the got up and got dressed, by making them specific, you can actually reveal things about your character and their circumstances. The best details do several jobs, so make detail your ally. What can details do for you if you put thought into choosing the right ones? Well, detail can reveal place. Detail is, of course, what creates the visuals in a written story. It tells us what the place looks like and sounds like and smells like, but it can also do more. Details can also reveal character. That rapper I mentioned earlier, in what became a novella called Gotham, here's the first time the journalist sees him. Nasty Boy is sitting on a plush red Louis XIV chaise longue, his rapper's jacket slung over the gilt-turned arm with a baseball cap set on top of it. Below his right eye, he has a scar that's wider than it should be, like a small, pale pink pair of lips or a kiss, with the dots of failed sutures along its edges. There's a line of whiskery boy's moustache running along his upper lip. His hair is gathered in tight cornrows, ending in coloured beads. He looks younger than 19, younger than his photos, as if he's still growing into the track pants that balloon around his invisible legs. He looks like a kid who was borrowed from his big brother's wardrobe and been told to sit there and sit still while a parent attends to some business nearby. He never had that life though. I know that much. And that leads to one more thing that details can do. Details can cue action, dialogue, or recollection. If there's something you need to happen, you need it to look as though it came entirely from the story, not from the author needing it to happen. For example, you need a character to recall a crucial piece of backstory at a particular time. How do you do it? Detail. Put something in the scene that compels the character to think about that particular piece of backstory, and all of a sudden, it's there naturally, and the reader won't even realize you were involved. All of this helps make the author an invisible participant in the story and makes the story something that happens between a reader and the characters, and that's what we want. Your own life might offer useful detail, imagination might offer useful details, and beyond them, the wider world has plenty waiting for you, and thanks to technology, it's never been easier to find. So research, read, and Google. Make notes. If you don't know a place in your story really well, drive on the streets. Look at Google Maps Street View. Go on it that way. Go to real estate agents' websites to see what houses look like there inside and out. So let's take a look at, how about that house just there, down there? Let's take a look at that because it's for sale. There we are inside that house. And the more details you can find and don't have to invent, the more imaginative energy you can spend on your characters and story. Of course, current real estate agents' websites might not be a big help if you're setting a story 2,000 years ago, but other websites might be, and you've got the imagination and the skills to find them. Well, let's go back a step to details, cueing, action, dialogue, or recollection. Supposing you've decided your character has to recall something about their grandmother when they arrive in this house. Can you pick a detail there that might start them thinking about their grandmother? Just have a look at that, see what you think. Now for me, I came up with a couple straight away. The bedroom, the bed frames, the wrought iron bed frames there, and maybe even the wallpaper. Might have made me think of my grandmother's house. If the character was my sort of age, then those things would be right. So if I needed to send the character into that room in the house and recall something about their grandmother, I could use something like those as the trigger. But on the subject of houses, let's take a look at this house again. This time, I don't want you to use detail to just show place. I also want you to reveal something about the character who is revealing it to us. So I'm going to give you two choices here. You can take one of these choices or the other, whatever works for you. Choice number one, it's nighttime. Your protagonist has arrived at this house with a torch and is fearful of what might be inside. That's choice number one. Choice number two, it's daytime. Your protagonist has inherited this house with high hopes, and this is the first time they've seen it, other than pictures from decades ago that showed it as a mansion. So those are the two choices. Pick one of those. Look at the picture and choose details that you can see there that will let you reveal the rundown state of the house and the emotional state of the character. Fearful in the first, badly disappointed in the second. Think and see if you can write a sentence or two that can convey some of that. So pick one of those, or maybe even try both of them and see how differently you might use the specific physical characteristics of the house. I gave myself 2 minutes for this. You can give yourself a couple of minutes as well. I gave myself 2 minutes for this, to respond to each of those. Here's what I came up with in my 2 minutes for the first one. The light from my torch catches on a shard of window glass. One of the dead trees nearby throws a shadow like a claw across the bare timber of the front wall. The entrance closes around me like a trap. So that was the first. And the second, the gutters are all gone, all of them, and sun and weather have scoured the paint from the walls. I've seen photos from a time when the paint was fresh and white and the place looked like a mansion, my grandfather's childhood, in this house he has left to me. I heard all the stories. And now the roof is rust and the walls are tilting in, the house folding in on itself, as if exhaling its last breath.
So the next descriptor is the discerning combination of a range of grammatically accurate or appropriate language structures, including clauses and sentences, to achieve particular purposes. Now, this is another area where we can have a bit of fun and a bit of a play around, because if you look at the words, it's accurate or appropriate language structures. Now, you might have a character who's not particularly well educated, so they're not going to speak particularly grammatically correctly. Again, if we're using dialogue, we don't speak the same way that we write. So we might expect our writing to be very formal and very accurate, but the way that we speak might not be. We might not speak in complete sentences. We might have one-word sentences. We might use slang or abbreviations. And that's absolutely fine because it is appropriate. But if you want to do something like that, you have to be really careful that you show the marker that you've done it deliberately. So if you've got bad grammar and bad vocabulary the whole way through your piece of writing, that's not going to be effective. That's just going to show that you don't have a control of the language. But if you have a character who speaks in a particular way, in an ungrammatical way, then that's going to show technique and subtlety and mastering the language to achieve a particular purpose.
You've probably noticed that this one says grammatically accurate / appropriate, and accurate and appropriate aren't synonyms. There's room to diverge from accurate if it's appropriate. That gives you the freedom any writer needs to make choices based on what's right for the characters and the material. One place this particularly applies is dialogue. The final third of your planning can be a good time to work on this because you need to have found your characters to be able to do it. Dialogue presents you with particular opportunities. Dialogue can introduce useful detail in a seamless way. Dialogue can pivot the story. Dialogue can reveal character. Here's how well that can work. Here is an extract from a Year 12 student story written for assessment. I spotted a man dressed as an old-fashioned redcoat leaning on one of the cutouts, talking to two locals enjoying the only air-conditioned building in town. I walked up to the redcoat and asked him about the local tribe. I couldn't tell you to save my life, mate, he laughed. There's nothing left of him to find out anymore either. He turned back to his conversation as I left the building. Now, I left some of the narration either side so you can see how deliberate, distinct, and effective this line of dialogue is. If you think about it, can you tell me anything about the character who's speaking? If you think about that, the voice of that character, how that character constructs sentences, the language use of that character, you might be able to, you'll start inferring things about that character's age. Maybe you'll even start seeing them. You might get a sense of where they fit in society. That character feels very much like an older person and a long-time Australian to me. I'm getting a sense of that character just from what that character's saying. It's exactly the kind of speech that I mentioned earlier. That sort of line where you find a connection with the voices of your characters. It's a line you can have in your head to keep that character's dialogue on track, but it's also brilliantly revealing of character in a way that is very economical and definitely showing rather than telling. It's a powerful example of the difference between purposeful dialogue and just having people say stuff. Don't fall into the habit of having your characters say stuff because that's what people do. It will not be the powerful writing you're aiming for. Include your character's speech when dialogue is necessary and revealing of character, as this is, or revealing of detail, or a catalyst for action.
And then finally, we come to the discerning use of written features, including conventional spelling and punctuation, to achieve particular purposes. Now, this one's a little bit different because even in dialogue, it's going to be spoken. So we don't need to spell these words badly or punctuate them badly. In fact, if we have a character who, for example, drops the G in the ing words, we need to actually put in an apostrophe to show that we know that a letter has been left out. So this one you don't get as much room to move as the previous descriptor. Make sure that any punctuation that you use any dialogue that you use is punctuated correctly. So here's a few tips here. A narrative's not written in peel paragraphs, okay? So we need to get out of that very formulaic structure there. You have to know how to punctuate direct speech, and you need to know that every speaker begins on a new line. And if you need to revisit things like this, then it's worthwhile doing so. Unconventional language choices can add interest and characterization, and that's great, but poor punctuation and grammar just detract from it. It also makes it much harder for the marker to read. And let's face it, the marker's going to be reading a lot of stories over this time. So you want to make their job as easy as you possibly can. The last thing you want to do is get your marker offside. So here we're not playing. What we're trying to show the markers is that after 13 years of schooling, we can nail our spelling, our grammar, and our punctuation. And it's really important that we don't let these little things slip us up, because we can lose marks carelessly and unnecessarily if we do.
The key here is to make it purposeful. Beyond that, you have some room to move. Your story might well aim to persuade the reader of something, but it does it through subtlety and through its characters, not through being structured and written like a persuasive piece. Be mindful of that at both a story and a sentence level. Ask yourself, what business am I trying to achieve with this story? What business am I trying to achieve with this sentence? If you decide to manipulate spelling and punctuation, it needs to be purposeful and it needs to be consistent. Always remember your reader, and in this case, your reader is marking against a fixed set of criteria. Give them the best, most impactful version you can of what they're looking for. So if you bend any rules, that reader needs to see that you meant it and why you meant it and that it added something. There is a difference between a purposeful, consistent, and successful departure from the norm and a writer making a mess of things, and it needs to remain clear that you're on the right side of that line. So use that week you have to prepare and turn up ready. Work your people out, work your structure out, find detail, find the voices you need. When you turn up to the exam, use your planning time to note some of this down and map your story out. that puts you in the best possible position to turn out something great in the time you've got. Of course, writing under exam conditions puts you at a disadvantage in some ways. When I write, people will judge me, but the writing's not done under exam conditions, and I get to take my work through several drafts. But there is one clear advantage you have over me. You're writing for one reader, and you have been told in advance precisely what they're looking for. All of those marking descriptors that we've been discussing today. I'm writing in the hope of hooking many thousands of readers, and they all want something slightly different, and they don't know that. And I don't know exactly what it is in each case, so I can't please everybody. I once wrote a book that made someone laugh so much they got laryngospasm. Okay, it's not that little girl. She's fine. She's just pretending. Laryngospasm is when the muscles around your larynx spasm so much that you actually can't breathe. And this particular person ended up in an intensive care unit in Canada with a tube down there so they could breathe until the muscles relaxed, and then they were okay again. So that was a lot of laughing at a book that I thought that I wanted to be a funny book. But I have had the opposite effect too when I've been wanting to make people laugh. Just over 20 years ago, I had a book called Bachelor Kisses published, and the promotional tour started in Brisbane on a Monday night. We had hundreds of people there. They all got a copy of the book. I signed all the hundreds of books. I got to bed late, feeling like a big success, thinking this tour is going exactly the way I want it to go. And I got up the next morning, went to the airport, met my publicist there. We got on the plane together. And as she sat down, we sat down on the plane. I had the aisle seat. She was in from me. And she pointed across me to the other side of the aisle. And she said, look, look. And I turned around and snuck a look at what was going on over there. And there's a woman on the other side of the aisle from me who was reading my book. She was sitting there reading my novel, Zigzag Street. And my publicist said to me, people are reading you on planes now. You've totally made it when people are reading you on planes. I was going, yes, big event to start the tour. People are reading me on planes. I've totally made it. This is great. Within 5 minutes, that woman was asleep. And not just asleep. She was deep asleep. She was asleep with a book open on her chest and her head lolling to one side. And she started drooling. That's what I had done to her. This book was so uncompelling to her that she was deeply unconscious. It was like the book was a general anesthetic rather than a book. So that was pretty disappointing. But then we hit turbulence. We hit turbulence and started bouncing around. I thought, it's going to wake her up. It's going to wake her up. And it didn't wake her up. And the turbulence got worse, more bouncing, more bouncing. It got worse again. And the flight attendants had to go and buckle themselves in. So no one was moving around. Still didn't wake her because my book had practically killed her. So there she was, just kind of dead with my book on her chest. But then the turbulence got so bad, the book started jumping around and then it slid off her and landed in the aisle face down with a thump. And so there was the book in the aisle face down. And because it was turbulent, the book started sliding up and down the aisle with the turbulence. It was sliding up. It was the only moving thing as we were trying all to be okay. And sliding up and down the aisle. And people were looking at it. People started seeing it as it slid past them in both directions. And they were going, what's going on? Why isn't the owner of that book picking it up? And then they were thinking, who does it belong to? And they were looking at it and looking at it, trying to work it out. And as they looked at it more and more, they noticed that. They noticed that photo on the back cover. And they'd look at the back photo and then they'd look up at me. And then they'd give me this look that said, you must be the saddest author in the world if you think you need to promote your book by sliding it up and down the aisle of a plane during turbulence. I survived that. The tour went all right, still in the game. But you know, you can't please everybody, but you know what your reader wants. You're writing for a reader who, as much as possible, checks their personal preferences at the door and measures what you've done against this. So that's what we set out to get you ready for today. You need to write the best, most compelling, most emotionally engaging and convincing 800 to 1,000 words that you can. You need to contemplate your story, plan your story, and deliver your story with impact and with ticks in these boxes. Use the tools we talked about today and you'll do that. And unlike me, you'll never be responsible for this.